The apron, starched to the stiffness of old parchment, felt like a yoke around Clara Jenkins's neck. Each night, its weight was a physical reminder of the invisible burdens she carried. The crinkled eviction notice tucked under a magnet on her refrigerator door, the mounting pharmacy bills for her grandfather's medication, and the suffocating silence of the small, dusty workshop that had once been the center of her universe. Now her world was circumscribed by the plush crimson carpets of the Elysian, a gilded cage in downtown Chicago where the city's titans came to feast. The Elysian wasn't merely a restaurant. It was a stage set for the performance of wealth. The patrons were the cast, draped in bespoke suits and glittering with jewels that could settle all of Clara's debts with a single flash. The staff were the ghosts in the machine, trained to anticipate needs without being seen, to speak only when spoken to exist as extensions of the restaurant's opulent ambiance. Clara, at 20, had become a master of spectral efficiency. She could navigate the labyrinth of tables, her tray laden with cuisine that cost more than her monthly rent, her face a carefully constructed mask of serene deference. Tonight, a charge hummed in the air, a frequency of high-stakes commerce mixed with the scent of seared scallops in aged Bordeaux. A monumental deal was being finalized in the restaurant's most coveted private space, the Chamberlain Room. Her manager, a perpetually frayed man named Mr. Abernathy, had cornered her by the service station earlier, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Jenkins!" he'd hissed, his eyes darting nervously towards the private room's heavy oak door. "The Croft party. Table 1. This is Julian Croft. You understand? This isn't the night for a misplaced fork or a slow water refill. This is zero-mistake territory." Clara understood. Everyone with a pulse in the financial world knew Julian Croft. He was a leviathan of the tech sector, a man whose face stared out from magazine covers with headlines like "The Silicon Prairie Shark" and "Croft's Digital Dynasty." He was infamous for his brutal efficiency in acquiring and dismantling companies, and for a personal demeanor that made corporate raiding look like a pleasantry. He was the epitome of new money, a digital barbarian who had stormed the gates of the old establishment and was now looking to claim its treasures as his own. To Clara, he was just another name on a reservation, another hurdle to clear before she could get back to what truly mattered. Survival. After her shift, she would ride the clattering L train back to the west side, to the small apartment above the failing clock shop she shared with her grandfather, Elias. Elias Jenkins, a man who could once coax life back into the most intricate 18th century timepieces, with hands as steady as a surgeon's, now spent his days in a worn leather armchair, his world circumscribed by the four walls of their living room. A degenerative tremor in his hands, a cruel irony for a master horologist, had stolen his livelihood and now threatened to steal his spirit. The doctors called it a progressive neurological condition, a bland and terrifying phrase that translated into a mountain of bills for specialists and treatments that Clara's wages, a patchwork of hourly pay and fickle tips, could never hope to summit. As she polished a wine glass until it squeaked, her mind slipped its leash, drifting back to a different time, a time filled with the scent of brass and lubricating oil. She didn't remember her parents, who were lost to a car crash when she was a toddler, but she remembered the universe of her grandfather's workshop. Elias Jenkins wasn't a billionaire, but he possessed a wealth Julian Croft could never acquire. He was a custodian of time itself, a living library of escapements, gears, and pendulums. His home, their home, was filled not with stock portfolios, but with the gentle, rhythmic ticking of 100 tiny hearts. He had been her teacher, her entire world. He hadn't just taught her to repair clocks. He had taught her their language. They would sit for hours at his workbench, Elias's voice a low, patient murmur, as he explained the genius of a brigade tourbillon or the rugged simplicity of a German cuckoo clock's movement. He taught her French and German, not from books, but from the faded maker's marks on antique clock faces and the technical manuals he had brought with him from the old country. Their bedtime stories were tales of the great clockmakers, of Harrison's quest for longitude, of the delicate art of enameling a watch dial. He had given her more than a skill. He had given her a legacy, a key to a world of precision, beauty, and history. Then that world began to grind to a halt. The rise of smartphones and digital everything had rendered his craft a quaint anachronism. The wealthy collectors who once sought him out had grown old or died, their children preferring smartwatches to grandfather clocks. The final blow was the notice from a real estate developer, a Mr. Sterling, who had bought their building and half the block. He was evicting the old tenants to make way for luxury condos. Their life's work, Elias's entire history, was about to be bulldozed. The stress had accelerated his decline, the tremors worsening, the light in his eyes dimming. Clara, who had once dreamed of studying mechanical engineering, was now trapped. Her profound understanding of physics and micromechanics reduced to calculating the optimal trajectory for pouring wine without splashing. Her fluency in technical French was useful only for deciphering the names on the wine list. A curt snap of fingers jolted her back to the present. A man at table 9 was glaring, his empty water glass a monument to her inattention. "My apologies, sir," she murmured, a hot flush creeping up her neck as she hurried to the water pitcher. She was losing her edge. Abernathy's warning echoed in her ears. 0 mistakes. She took a deep, steadying breath, shoving the memories and the fear into the locked box in her mind where she kept her despair. She was not Clara Jenkins, granddaughter of a master craftsman. She was server 23, and the Croft party was about to enter the Chamberlain room. She straightened her apron, the stiff fabric a constant chafing reminder of her reality, and braced herself for the storm. The grand entrance of the Elysian swung open, and the restaurant's ambient hum momentarily dipped, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Julian Croft did not simply enter a room, he colonized it. He was a man built on a scale larger than life, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His hair was prematurely silver at the temples, a distinguished touch that contrasted with the restless, predatory energy in his eyes. They were the color of a stormy sea, constantly scanning, assessing, and assigning a value to everything they saw. They swept over the opulent dining room with an expression of profound impatience, as if all this tradition and ceremony were a tedious but necessary prelude to the business at hand. On one side was a team of 2 lawyers, men in their 40s who radiated a nervous energy, their briefcases clutched like shields. On his other arm was Isabel Sterling, a woman sculpted by wealth and ambition. She was the daughter of the very developer who was evicting Clara and her grandfather, a fact that sent a jolt of ice water through Clara's veins. Dressed in a sheath of emerald silk that shimmered with every step, Isabel's smile was a masterpiece of cosmetic dentistry, bright and utterly devoid of warmth. She surveyed the room not as a guest, but as a queen surveying her court, her gaze a mixture of entitlement and disdain. But it was the 2 men following them that captured Clara's attention. They were older, in their late 70s, with faces etched by time and concentration. They were dressed in conservative, perfectly tailored woolen suits that spoke of quality rather than fashion. They were the Dubois brothers, Jean-Luc and Antoine, the legendary proprietors of Dubois and Fil, one of the last independent family-owned watchmaking houses in Switzerland. Unlike Croft, who radiated a palpable hunger for the future, these 2 men seemed to carry the weight and wisdom of the past. They observed the restaurant with a quiet appreciation for the craftsmanship of the polished wood and the intricate plasterwork, their eyes missing nothing. They were the prize. Croft, the digital emperor, wanted to acquire their centuries-old company, to add their legacy to his portfolio like a rare jewel. These men were the reason for the 0 mistake warning. Mr. Abernathy seemed to glide out of the woodwork, his posture a study in frantic servility. "Mr. Croft, welcome. The Chamberlain room is prepared for you." Croft offered a curt nod, already moving towards the private room, his entourage falling into formation behind him. As the procession passed Clara's station, his gaze flickered over her for less than a second. It wasn't a look of dismissal, it was a look of complete non-perception. To him, she was an object, a component of the service apparatus, as inanimate as a coat rack. Isabel, however, subjected her to a slow, deliberate appraisal, from her sensible black shoes to the single stray wisp of hair that had escaped her bun. A tiny condescending smile played on her perfect lips, a silent message that screamed, "This is my world. You just work in it." Clara felt the familiar coil of resentment tighten in her gut, but she held her spine rigid, her face a placid lake. She had faced down arrogant men and their beautiful, cruel consorts before. It was in the job description. Jenkins, Abernathy hissed, scurrying back from the private room like a panicked crab. They're seated. Go. Now. Remember the protocol. Pour the water. Present the menus. Don't speak. Don't exist. She nodded, her hands steady as she lifted the heavy silver tray with the leather-bound menus and a crystal carafe of iced water. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the door to the Chamberlain room. She could already hear Croft's sharp, decisive voice slicing through the silence, talking about market share and quarterly projections. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a sanctuary of old-world luxury. A long mahogany table was set for 6. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, and against the far wall stood a magnificent grandfather clock, its polished cherrywood case gleaming in the soft light. The mood, however, was anything but serene. Croft was at the head of the table, a general in his command tent. Isabel sat beside him, occasionally touching his arm, while the lawyers sat stiffly, pens poised over notepads. The Dubois brothers, Jean-Luc and Antoine, sat opposite, their expressions calm but unreadable. Clara moved with the silent grace of a shadow, pouring water and placing the menus. When she reached Croft, he gestured impatiently at the menu without even glancing at her. I'll have the New York strip, medium rare, and a bottle of the Euro 5 Lafite. Get it breathing. An excellent choice, sir, Clara said softly. He finally looked up, his stormy eyes narrowing, as if startled that a piece of the scenery had just spoken. Just get it done, he clipped. She turned to the Swiss guests. And for you, gentlemen? Jean-Luc, the elder brother, offered her a brief, courteous smile. It was the first glimmer of genuine politeness she'd seen from the table, and it momentarily disarmed her. He opened the menu, a heavy tome written entirely in formal, classical French. It was a special menu, curated for this specific dinner, a nod to the Dubois brothers' heritage. His brow furrowed slightly as he read. He and his brother exchanged a few quiet words in their native tongue, the sound a soft, precise cadence that stood in stark contrast to Croft's brutalist English. Clara felt a pang of something akin to homesickness, the sound of the language a phantom echo from her grandfather's workshop. Croft's patience was visibly fraying. Is there a problem, gentlemen? Just order the Dover sole. It's what people order when they don't know what to order. Jean-Luc cleared his throat. His English was precise with a light French accent. There is no problem, Mr. Croft. It is simply that the culinary terms are very specific. They speak of a classical technique. We wish to understand the chef's philosophy. Right, Croft grunted, turning his glare on Clara. Well, explain it to them. What's good? The fish? The duck? Let's expedite this. Clara opened her mouth to recite the standard, simplified English descriptions Abernathy had drilled into them. But before a word could escape, Isabel let out a delicate musical laugh that was somehow sharper than broken glass. Oh, Julian, darling, be serious, she purred, her gaze dripping with pitying amusement as it fell upon Clara. What could she possibly know about it? It's all in French. I doubt she can even pronounce hors d'oeuvres correctly. She probably just points at pictures. The insult landed with the chilling precision of an icicle to the heart. The lawyers exchanged nervous smirks. Croft's lips twisted into a cruel, knowing grin. The air in the room became thick and suffocating with Clara's humiliation. She stood frozen, the heavy menu in Jean-Luc's hand suddenly feeling like a tablet of stone, etched with a judgment against her. The weight of her apron had never felt so heavy, the yoke never so tight. The silence in the Chamberlain room became a tangible thing, a high-tension wire drawn taut. Jean-Luc and Antoine Dubois exchanged another glance, this one filled with a quiet but unmistakable disapproval. They were men from a culture where craftsmanship and dignity were paramount, whether in a watchmaker or a waiter. The casual, public cruelty was an offense against their sense of order. Yet they were in Julian Croft's territory, playing his game. Croft, however, seemed to draw energy from the tension. He thrived in environments where he could establish and enforce a hierarchy. For him, this was not just dinner. It was a demonstration of power. She has a point, he declared, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers, the picture of magnanimous authority. He waved a dismissive hand at the menu. It's all just overpriced protein. Gentlemen, I'm trying to offer you a piece of the future, and we're getting bogged down in the semantics of sauce. Antoine, the younger and more reserved of the two brothers, attempted to defuse the situation. He addressed Clara directly, his voice gentle, as if trying to erect a small shield around her. Mademoiselle, perhaps you could just tell us about this item, he said, pointing to a line on the menu. The description is poetic. Clara's eyes found the words, Pigeonneau en crapaudine, sauce diable. Squab flattened and grilled with a piquant devil's sauce. She could almost smell the thyme and pepper, almost hear the sizzle. Her grandfather had loved classical French cooking, and he had described such dishes to her from memory, linking the culinary terms to their historical roots. A flood of explanations, of history and technique, welled up inside her, but Abernathy's voice was a steel door in her mind. Be simple. Be invisible. That is the grilled squab, sir, she said, her voice a low, steady monotone. It is very popular. Croft let out a derisive snort. The grilled squab. There you have it. A bird cooked over a fire. Can we move on now? He directed his full, impatient attention back to the brothers, his voice dropping into a tone of aggressive reason. Look, Jean-Luc, Antoine, your company is a masterpiece, a legacy, but it's a legacy operating on 19th century principles in a 21st century market. I'm offering you capitalization, global distribution, a way to ensure the Dubois name survives for another 200 years. That's what we should be discussing, not foul. Jean-Luc held up a hand, his expression calm but firm. Mr. Croft, with all due respect, the way a chef approaches a classic dish tells you everything. Does he respect the tradition? Does he have the discipline for the technique? Or does he take shortcuts? For us, a man's character is revealed in such details. Precision, patience, and honor are not just for watchmaking. His eloquent explanation was utterly lost on Croft. To the tech billionaire, this was just more European obstructionism, a deliberate refusal to get to the point. The numbers, the contracts, the acquisition. His patience, a notoriously finite resource, evaporated completely. He slammed his palm down on the table. The silverware jumped and the water in the glasses shivered. Isabel gave a little start. The lawyers looked like they wanted to crawl under the table. Enough! Croft's voice was a crack of thunder in the small room. He fixed his furious gaze on Clara, his eyes blazing. He no longer saw a person, if he ever had. He saw the embodiment of the inefficiency and tradition that was wasting his valuable time. How is she supposed to contribute to this conversation? He boomed, gesturing at her as if she were a faulty piece of equipment. He addressed the Dubois brothers directly, his voice dripping with scorn. We are here to negotiate a 9-figure deal, and we are being held hostage by a menu this girl is probably using to practice her alphabet. He paused, letting the cruelty hang in the air before delivering the coup de grace, his voice filled with a triumphant theatrical finality. Honestly, gentlemen, what is the point of asking her? She can't even read the menu. The words were not just an insult. They were an indictment, a pronouncement of her worthlessness in his world. In one savage sentence, he had erased her history, her intelligence, her very humanity, reducing her to the uniform she wore. Isabel let out that same tinkling, venomous laugh. The lawyers fidgeted, intensely studying the patterns on the carpet. Clara stood perfectly still. The world seemed to narrow to a single point, Croft's smug, conquering face, the face of a man who had never known the gnawing fear of a final demand notice, never known the ache of watching a loved one's legacy crumble into dust. And in that profound, echoing silence, something inside her shifted. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet, clean break. It was the part of her that had stoically endured the condescending glances, the part that had swallowed her pride to take this job, the part that cleaned up the remnants of feasts she could never afford while her brilliant grandfather faded away. It was the part of her that had been silent for too long. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, a phrase he would often repeat while working on a particularly difficult piece. La précision est la politesse des rois. Précision is the politeness of kings. He believed it applied to everything, to a well-oiled gear, a finely chopped onion, a carefully chosen word. Dignity was in the details. Her chin lifted. Her eyes, which had been fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, now met Julian Croft's gaze head-on. The mask of serene deference dissolved, and in its place was a flicker of cold, focused fire that had been banked for years. She took a single, deliberate breath, and the tension in the room coiled even tighter. Just as she was about to speak, a new sound, or rather a lack of it, intruded. Dong, dong, dong. The magnificent grandfather clock against the wall, which had been marking the passage of time with a deep, sonorous chime every quarter hour, began to strike the hour of 8. It managed 3 chimes, each one sounding slightly more labored than the last. Then after the third, there was a faint, discordant clunk from deep within its casing, and the pendulum, which had been swinging in a majestic, hypnotic arc, stuttered and came to a dead stop. Silence. The sudden absence of the clock's gentle, rhythmic ticking made the room feel dead. Mr. Abernathy, who had been hovering outside the door, must have heard it too. He scurried in, his face pale with horror. "Mr. Croft, my deepest apologies. I don't know what happened. It's never... I'll have someone from maintenance look at it immediately." Croft waved him away with a growl of disgust. "Just get it out of here. The last thing I need is more broken antiques." But the Dubois brothers were not looking at Croft. They were staring at the silent clock, their expressions transformed. It was a subtle shift, but Clara, a student of quiet craftsmen, saw it clearly. It was a look of deep professional offense. To them, a finely tuned machine failing was not an inconvenience. It was a moral failing, a breach of contract with the laws of physics and craftsmanship. "A shame," Jean-Luc murmured, his voice laced with disappointment. "A beautiful piece, a Lemaire, from the early 19th century, if I'm not mistaken." As Abernathy and another waiter clumsily approached the clock, preparing to wheel the massive thing away, Clara's eyes were locked on it. She hadn't just heard the chimes, she had listened to them. She'd noticed it when she first entered the room. The ticking was slightly off, a millisecond's hesitation at the apex of the pendulum's swing. A watchmaker's ear. She saw what the others missed, a tiny, almost invisible sliver of dark wood, a piece of decorative inlay from the doorframe, that had been dislodged when Abernathy had rushed in and had fallen into the minute gap between the pendulum and the casing wall. It wasn't broken, it was merely obstructed. This was her moment. It was a terrible, terrifying risk. But the alternative, to stand there and absorb the humiliation, to let Croft's verdict be the final word, was unthinkable. She took a step forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the nervous fussing of the manager. All eyes turned to her. Croft's face was a thundercloud of fury. "What is it now?" Clara ignored him, her attention directed entirely to the 2 men who would understand. She switched from English to the formal, precise French her grandfather had taught her, the language of horological journals and academic texts. "Monsieur," she began, her tone respectful but firm, stunning the table into a new kind of silence. "If you would permit me, the clock is not broken. The movement has simply been impeded." The Dubois brothers stared at her, their eyes wide with astonishment. It wasn't just that she spoke their language. It was the specific technical vocabulary she used. It was like a homeless man suddenly starting to recite perfect Shakespearean verse. She walked calmly to the clock, Abernathy frozen in her path. With a steady hand, she opened the glass door of the clock's case. She pointed, her finger unwavering. "There. You see, the pendulum's transit is obstructed. The escapement has been arrested, but the mainspring is still under tension. It is a simple matter of removing the obstruction and resetting the beat." She didn't wait for permission. With the delicacy of a surgeon, she reached in and removed the tiny sliver of wood. Then gently, she gave the heavy brass pendulum a precise push. Not a shove, but a carefully calibrated impulse to restart its swing in the correct rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, Tock. The steady, reassuring heartbeat of the clock filled the room once more. It was perfect. The beat was even, the rhythm flawless. Clara closed the glass door and turned back to the table. The room was utterly, profoundly silent. Abernathy's jaw was hanging open. The lawyers looked like they had just witnessed an act of magic. Isabel Sterling's face was a mask of livid disbelief, her perfect makeup unable to hide the venom in her eyes. And Julian Croft? He was speechless. The raw fury had been wiped from his face, replaced by a look of stunned, grudging recalculation. He had built an empire by processing data and identifying unforeseen variables. He had just encountered a variable he couldn't have predicted in a million years. He had tried to swat a fly, and it had revealed itself to be a hummingbird, a creature of impossible precision and grace. It was Jean-Luc Dubois who finally broke the spell. He slowly placed his menu on the table. He looked at Clara, and his eyes, the eyes of a man who had spent 70 years judging the character of metal and men, were shining with a profound, astonished respect. "Incroyable," he breathed. "Incredible." He looked at his brother, who nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile on his lips. He then turned his gaze back to Clara. "Young lady," he said, switching back to his careful English, his voice thick with a new warmth. "You have the ear of a true artisan, and the hands of one as well." He gestured to the empty chair beside him, a place reserved for a senior partner, not a server. "Please, sit, join us." The invitation was a bomb detonated in the center of the Elysian's rigid social structure. It was a violation of every rule. Mr. Abernathy looked like he was about to faint, but before Clara could politely refuse, Julian Croft found his voice. It was a low, dangerous sound, stripped of its earlier bluster. "What?" he asked, his stormy eyes locked on her, no longer with contempt, but with the dawning, unsettling realization that he had made a colossal, strategic error. "Is your name?" "My name," she said, her voice clear and proud, the ghost of her grandfather smiling at her side, "is Clara Jenkins." The name Jenkins in itself meant nothing. It was a common name, an anonymous name. But spoken by this young woman, in this room, after what had just transpired, it held a new and sudden weight. Antoine Dubois, the quieter brother, leaned forward, his gaze intense and searching. "Jenkins," he repeated, tasting the word. He studied Clara's face, her steady eyes, the quiet confidence in her posture. "Forgive my impertinence, mademoiselle, but are you by any chance related to Elias Jenkins, the horologist?" The sound of her grandfather's full name, spoken with such reverence in this place, was a key turning in a lock deep inside Clara. The dam of her composure, so rigidly held for years, finally broke. A wave of grief, pride, and fierce, protective love washed over her. Her eyes glistened. "He is my grandfather," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. A thick, meaningful silence settled over the table. Jean-Luc placed a hand on his brother's arm, a look of profound understanding passing between them. His face softened with a sorrowful recognition. "My dear child," he said, his voice gentle, "I am so very sorry. Your grandfather, he is a legend, a master. When I was a young man, just starting, he wrote a monograph on the restoration of 18th century escapements. It was brilliant, a work of genius. He taught a whole generation of us, even from across an ocean. We all believed he had retired, disappeared." "What happened to him?" Antoine asked, his voice low and concerned. "His shop on the west side was a landmark for true connoisseurs. Every word was a vindication, a confirmation of the world she knew, the world that men like Croft and Sterling sought to erase. Tears she had refused to shed in the face of eviction notices and overdue bills now threatened to fall freely." Julian Croft watched this exchange, his mind operating at lightning speed. His deal, his prize acquisition, was spinning wildly out of his control. The waitress he had publicly humiliated was not just some girl, she was the granddaughter of a man his targets considered a living legend. He hadn't just been arrogant, he had committed a blasphemy against the very religion of craftsmanship he was trying to buy into. He had desecrated a holy site without even knowing its significance. "Sit," Jean-Luc insisted again, his tone no longer an invitation, but a command. He looked directly at Croft, his eyes like polished steel. "Miss Jenkins will dine with us." It was a gauntlet thrown down. Croft, a man who hadn't taken an order from anyone in 20 years, was cornered. To refuse would be to insult the Dubois brothers in the most profound way possible, ending the deal before it even began. He clenched his jaw, the muscle twitching in his cheek, and gave a short, sharp nod. Clara hesitated for only a second. The thought of Mr. Abernathy's impending aneurysm was a distant concern. The chance to speak of her grandfather, to honor his name in this room filled with power, was an opportunity forged in a crucible of humiliation, and she would not let it pass. With deliberate, measured movements, she untied the strings of her starched apron. She folded the stiff, weighted fabric, the symbol of her servitude, and placed it on her empty serving tray. It was a quiet act of emancipation. Then, with her back straight and her head held high, she walked to the table and took the empty seat between Jean-Luc and Antoine. One of Croft's lawyers, scrambling to adjust to the radical shift in the room's power dynamic, clumsily lurched to his feet to pull the chair out for her. The gesture was so bizarrely out of sync with the events of the last hour that it bordered on the comical. For the next hour, the conversation was not about global distribution networks or market capitalization. It was about Elias Jenkins. Guided by the gentle, expert questions of the Dubois brothers, Clara spoke of her grandfather. She told them of his uncanny ability to diagnose a faulty movement by its sound alone, his encyclopedic knowledge of obscure clock-making dynasties, and the time they had spent an entire month fabricating a single, minuscule gear for a priceless antique. She spoke of his failing health and of the eviction notice from Sterling Development that hung over their heads like a guillotine. As she talked, the Dubois brothers listened with an almost painful intensity, nodding, asking follow-up questions, sharing their own anecdotes about the genius of Elias's long-lost monograph. On the other side of the table, Croft's camp was a tableau of silence. Isabel Sterling stared daggers at Clara, her face a thunderous mask of jealousy and rage. The name of her father's company, spoken as a villain in this new narrative, had made her position untenable. The lawyers looked at their notes, but they weren't writing, and Julian Croft was listening. He was listening to every single word. He was a processor of information, a seeker of patterns, and above all, of leverage. And amidst the emotional tapestry of Clara's story, he was beginning to see the outlines of a spectacular, unforeseen opportunity. "This developer, Sterling," Jean-Luc said, his voice rumbling with a cold anger. "He would throw a master like your grandfather out onto the street to build more glass boxes? This is an act of barbarism." "He is a persuasive businessman," Clara said, choosing her words carefully, the irony thick in her throat as she looked at Isabel. At the mention of Sterling Development, Croft's focus sharpened. The pieces of a complex, multi-dimensional puzzle were no longer just on the table. They were snapping into place with magnetic precision. Harrison Sterling wasn't just a random developer to him. He was a ruthless competitor in the high-stakes world of Chicago real estate, a world Croft's venture capital firm had recently and aggressively entered. Sterling had outmaneuvered him on 2 major downtown acquisitions in the past year, using tactics that skirted the edges of legality. Sterling was a thorn in his side, a rival he was already looking for a reason to crush. Suddenly, this dinner wasn't just about Dubois and Fils. It was about something much bigger. A weapon had just been placed in his hands, and it was aimed at 2 of his enemies. Jean-Luc Dubois, oblivious to the silent, predatory calculations happening across the table, reached over and gently patted Clara's hand. "The legacy of a man like Elias Jenkins must not be erased," he said with absolute conviction. He then lifted his gaze, now as sharp and penetrating as a diamond drill, and fixed it directly on Julian Croft. "Mr. Croft," Jean-Luc said, his voice stripped of all its earlier warmth, now as cool and hard as the steel of a watch spring. "We came here tonight to discuss a partnership. The House of Dubois is not merely a collection of assets and trademarks. It is a testament to 2 centuries of honor, integrity, and character. We would find it impossible to partner with any man who would stand by and allow such a grotesque injustice, an injustice brought to his own table, to proceed. The ultimatum was unspoken but perfectly clear. The entire deal for Dubois and Fils was now inextricably linked to the fate of an old, sick clockmaker and the future of the waitress Croft had tried to annihilate. Julian Croft was trapped, and he knew with the chilling certainty of a master strategist that the most valuable asset in the room was no longer his fortune, but the quiet, determined young woman sitting directly across from him. The atmosphere in the Chamberlain room had undergone a complete inversion of gravity. Julian Croft, the sun around which his entire corporate solar system revolved, was now a mere planet, caught in the pull of two old Swiss craftsmen and a 20-year-old waitress. His billion-dollar gambit for their company, the crown jewel of his new legacy brands division, was dangling by the single fragile thread of Clara Jenkins's future. He parsed the situation with the brutal, emotionless logic he applied to a failing startup. Asset: Clara Jenkins possesses unique, verifiable expertise in the admiration of the target, Dubois. Liability: her grandfather's impending eviction by Sterling Development. Threat: Harrison Sterling, a direct business rival, also the source of the liability. Opportunity: by eliminating the threat, Sterling, he solves the liability, which in turn secures the primary asset, the Dubois deal. The synergy was perfect, the logic unassailable. Solution: he had to save the clock shop, not out of charity, not out of honor, but as a strategic necessity. It was a move on a grand chessboard, a single, elegant maneuver that would neutralize a rival and secure a kingdom. He leaned forward, the mask of the impatient host gone, replaced by the focused, predatory intensity that had made him a billionaire. "Mr. Dubois," he said, his voice a low, commanding purr, "what is happening to Elias Jenkins is more than an injustice. It is a symptom of a sickness, a lack of respect for craftsmanship and legacy that men like Harrison Sterling represent. Sterling is not just a developer. He is a bottom feeder who prizes profit above all else." He then shifted his gaze, locking it onto Clara's. The contempt was gone, replaced by something far more formidable: partnership. "Miss Jenkins, you are fighting a battle against a tank with a handcrafted hammer. It's an admirable fight, but the outcome is predetermined." He paused, letting the harsh reality of her situation settle. "I, on the other hand, have a fleet of tanks. I have on permanent retainer the most vicious and effective team of real estate lawyers, forensic accountants, and opposition researchers in the country. They can find a zoning violation from 1982 or an illegal campaign donation as easily as I can check the time." He was offering her the full, terrifying might of his corporate arsenal. He was offering her an army to fight the war she was destined to lose. "I will deploy my entire legal division pro bono," he declared. "We will not just halt the eviction. We will launch a full-spectrum inquiry into every deal Harrison Sterling has ever made. We will scrutinize his building permits, his tax filings, his environmental impact reports. We will bleed him dry with legal fees and bury him in injunctions. We will make it so toxic for him to continue with this condo project that he will be forced to sell the building." He allowed a cold, thin smile to touch his lips. "And my holding company will be there to buy it at a significant discount." The offer was staggering in its scale and its ruthlessness. Clara felt a dizzying vertigo, a blend of exhilarating hope and profound unease. The man who had sought to crush her spirit less than an hour ago was now offering her the one thing she craved most: salvation for her grandfather's legacy. But it was a salvation delivered with the cold fury of a corporate assassin, not the warmth of a benefactor. It was a deal with the devil to save an angel. Jean-Luc and Antoine watched Croft, their faces impassive. They had laid down the test of character, and Croft was answering with overwhelming, brutal force. It was not, perhaps, the answer they had expected, but it was an answer nonetheless. "Why would you do this?" Clara asked, her voice steady. She was no one's fool. She knew this was not about her. Croft gave her a look that bordered on respect. He appreciated that she wasn't weeping with gratitude. She was questioning his motives, just as he would in her position. "Let's maintain transparency," he said, the corner of his mouth ticking upward. "Harrison Sterling is a business impediment. Removing him from the board has been on my agenda for some time. Ruining this particular project of his would be a significant victory for my own real estate ventures. The fact that this action also preserves a historical legacy your grandfather represents, and in doing so, satisfies the character requirements of my potential partners. He glanced meaningfully at the Dubois brothers. Well, that simply makes it a remarkably efficient, high-return investment. There it was. Cold, honest, utterly unsentimental. He wasn't her savior. She was his leverage, the key that unlocked both a corporate acquisition and a personal vendetta. Clara looked from Croft's predatory gaze to the solemn, watchful faces of the Dubois brothers. They had created this opening. They had used their own immense cultural capital to give her a voice. And now this terrifying, magnificent weapon was being offered to her. Could she bring herself to use it, even knowing it was wielded by a monster? For her grandfather, for the quiet, dusty workshop that was the only home she had ever known, for the legacy of 100 ticking hearts that deserved to keep beating. She thought of Elias, a man of quiet integrity and gentle hands. He would have abhorred Julian Croft's methods, but he would have fought to his last breath for his work. This was her fight now, and she couldn't win it with quiet dignity alone. She needed a battering ram. Croft was offering her the biggest one imaginable. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice imbued with a newfound strength. A wolfish grin, the first genuine expression of pleasure she had seen from him, spread across Julian Croft's face. The deal was back on. "Everything," he said. "Every lease agreement, every notice, every piece of paper you have related to the building and Sterling Development. My people will be in touch in the morning." He snapped his fingers, and one of his lawyers, jolted from his stupor, immediately began typing on his phone. "Get Eleanor Vance on the line, head of real estate litigation. Tell her to clear her entire docket. This is her only priority." The rest of the dinner was a surreal council of war. The exquisite food that Clara had been hired to serve was brought out, course after magnificent course, but the atmosphere was that of a campaign being planned. Clara, Croft, and the Dubois brothers discussed strategy, the history of the building, the players involved. Isabel sat in a storm of silent fury, a beautiful, obsolete ornament in a room that was now humming with purpose. By the time coffee was served, the first wave of the assault was already in motion. Croft, with his chilling efficiency, had already received a text from Eleanor Vance, confirming she was assembling her team for a 7 a.m. briefing. The Dubois brothers made it clear that while they were impressed, their final decision on the partnership would be contingent upon a successful outcome for Elias Jenkins. As the dinner concluded, Croft stood. He looked at Clara, who remained seated, no longer his server, but his strange and vital new ally. "My car will take you home, Miss Jenkins," he stated. It was a fact, not an offer. "Thank you, Mr. Croft, but I'm quite comfortable with the L train," she replied, a small, necessary act of defiance. It was a reminder to him and to herself that she was his partner in this one specific venture, not his possession. Jean-Luc Dubois smiled, a warm paternal expression. "Nonsense, my child. It would be our honor." He and Antoine insisted on escorting her, a gesture of both protection and profound respect. As Clara walked out of the Chamberlain room, flanked by the two legendary Swiss watchmakers, she paused at the door and looked back. Julian Croft was watching her, his phone already pressed to his ear, his eyes alight with the pure, exhilarating thrill of the hunt. He had come to the Elysian tonight to conquer a company. He was leaving with a far more complex campaign, a cause to champion, a rival to destroy, and a tentative, powerful alliance with the young woman whose spirit he had tried and failed to break. The game had been irrevocably changed, and the stakes were now higher and more personal than he could ever have imagined. The days that followed were a study in parallel lives. By night, Clara still wore the starched apron at the Elysian, gliding between tables and enduring Mr. Abernathy's bizarre new demeanor, which oscillated between terror and fawning respect. He knew something fundamental had shifted in the Chamberlain room, and he treated her as if she were a visiting royal in disguise. By day, her small apartment above the clock shop was transformed into a field office for Operation Takedown Sterling. Julian Croft's team was as good as he had promised, and far more terrifying. Eleanor Vance, a woman with a deceptively warm smile and the legal instincts of a great white shark, descended with a team of paralegals and investigators. They didn't treat Clara as a waitress. They treated her as the principal client and key witness. They spent hours with her and a visibly bewildered Elias, poring over decades of arcane leases, zoning maps, and city records. They digitized every document in the workshop, every faded receipt and brittle piece of correspondence. Croft remained a remote, powerful presence. He never visited the apartment, orchestrating the campaign from his downtown skyscraper. His communication came in the form of curt, encrypted emails and relayed commands, pushing the team forward with an unyielding, relentless momentum. This wasn't business for him. It was war, and he was its commanding general. The process was not a single, dramatic explosion, but a slow, methodical strangulation. Eleanor's team began by filing a series of injunctions, citing historical preservation statutes that no one had thought to consult. They questioned the building's original zoning variants from the 1970s. They discovered that Sterling Development's environmental impact study for the new condo construction was rushed and flawed. Each filing was a small paper cut, but they were inflicting thousands of them, bleeding Sterling's project dry with legal delays and mounting costs. The breakthrough came from the forensic accounting team. Digging into Harrison Sterling's other projects, they discovered a pattern. A shell corporation based in Delaware was consistently winning the contracts for waste disposal on Sterling's construction sites at vastly inflated prices. With the help of Croft's private investigators, they pierced the corporate veil and found that the shell company's sole beneficiary was Harrison Sterling's brother-in-law. It was a classic, flagrantly illegal self-dealing and kickback scheme. Croft didn't leak the information to the press. That was too messy, too unpredictable. Instead, he arranged a meeting. It was held in a sterile, neutral ground conference room at Eleanor Vance's law firm. On one side of the vast mahogany table sat Harrison Sterling and his team of lawyers, their faces a mixture of bravado and anxiety. On the other side sat Julian Croft, Eleanor Vance, and Clara. The Dubois brothers were patched in via a secure video link from Switzerland, their stern, watchful faces displayed on a large screen. Sterling arrived blustering, ready to accuse Croft of corporate harassment. He was cut short as Eleanor Vance, with the dispassionate precision of an autopsy report, laid out the evidence. The zoning challenges, the flawed environmental studies, and finally the color-coded charts and bank statements that detailed the kickback scheme, complete with sworn affidavits from disgruntled former employees of the waste disposal company whom Croft's investigators had persuaded to talk. By the end of the presentation, the color had drained from Harrison Sterling's face. All the bluster was gone, replaced by the pale, clammy look of a man staring into an abyss. Julian Croft leaned back in his chair, a picture of absolute predatory calm. He said nothing, allowing the crushing weight of the evidence to suffocate his rival. The resolution was swift and brutal. To avoid public prosecution in the utter collapse of his company, Sterling agreed to Croft's non-negotiable terms. He would immediately halt the condo project and sell the building and the entire block to Croft's holding company for its assessed value, without the lucrative zoning variances, a fraction of what he had expected to make. He would issue a private, formal apology to Elias Jenkins, and the Department of Justice would receive an anonymous tip about the kickback scheme, though Sterling's name would be carefully insulated in exchange for his brother-in-law's full cooperation. It was a complete and total surrender. A week later, a courier delivered a simple, thick envelope to the clock shop. Inside was a single document, the new deed for the building, naming Elias Jenkins as the owner of his workshop and the apartment above it, in perpetuity, protected by a historical trust established and funded by the Croft Foundation. The rest of the building would become a subsidized residence and workspace for other artisans and craftsmen. Clara sat with her grandfather at his workbench, the legal document resting between them. For the first time in years, the tremor in Elias's hands seemed to lessen. He looked around his workshop, not as a tenant on borrowed time, but as a king in his castle. The light had returned to his eyes. The name Jenkins, and the craft it represented, was safe. The next day, the long, dark car reappeared outside their building. Clara knew it was time. She met Julian Croft not in his office, but at the Chicago Cultural Center, under the vast, breathtaking Tiffany Dome. The Dubois brothers signed the final acquisition papers this morning, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the grand hall. They were impressed by the outcome. They have made it a condition of the deal that the new American division be overseen by someone who understands and respects the soul of the machine, as they put it. He looked at her, his expression uncharacteristically direct. The board, which now consists of myself and the brothers, has voted. We are creating a new position, Director of Heritage Brands. You would be responsible for guiding the integration of Dubois and Fils, for protecting its legacy while guiding it into the future. You would also be tasked with identifying other companies like it, businesses with immense cultural value but weak financial footing. We would acquire them, and you would be their custodian. He was offering her a new life, a world she thought was lost forever, but on a scale she had never imagined. She would not be a repairwoman, she would be a guardian of legacies. Why? She asked the same question as that night at dinner. You have what you wanted. You've won. Croft looked up at the intricate patterns of the glass dome above them. I build things that are obsolete in 5 years, he said, his voice quiet, almost reflective. Software, platforms, devices, they are disposable. That night in the restaurant, when you fixed that clock, I didn't just see a clever party trick. I saw a connection to something permanent, something real. My empire is built on sand, Miss Jenkins. I'm looking to acquire some stone for the foundation. He finally met her gaze. I am a shark, but even a shark understands the value of a lighthouse. It was the closest he would ever come to an apology, the most profound admission of respect he was capable of giving. Clara thought of the starched apron, of Isabel's sneer, of the crushing weight of her old life. And then she thought of her grandfather, of his gentle hands and the ticking hearts he had kept alive. This was the ultimate way to honor him. She took a deep breath. I accept, Mr. Croft, on one condition. Croft raised an eyebrow. My grandfather's monograph on escapement theory, she said. It was never properly published. The Alistair Vance Foundation, which I see your foundation has recently endowed, is a good model. I want to establish the Elias Jenkins Institute for Horological Preservation. It will be my first project. A slow, genuine smile spread across Julian Croft's face. It transformed his severe features, making him look younger, almost human. I look forward to reading your proposal, Director Jenkins. He had come for a company, but he had acquired a conscience. And Clara, the poor waitress who supposedly couldn't read the menu, had not only saved her grandfather's legacy, but had discovered the blueprint for her own.